All right, guys. I have the unenviable position of standing between you guys, a cup of coffee, and your evenings, and your chance to ask more detailed questions of the guys that we've got here today. So I'm going to try and make this short, and hopefully to the point. First of all, consumer engagement. There's been a lot going around on this topic recently, and just a few words on what's driven TransGrid to focus so heavily on consumer engagement at the moment. I think a lot of it is a bit obvious, but I'll walk through it anyway. Historically, TransGrid, like other network peers, has made judgments internally trying to balance cost, service, and risk, as you've heard today. They've done that both internally and through certain regulatory processes and procedures. Those were meant to safeguard consumers. Historically, a lot of these decisions, while still technical and difficult, were a little bit more straightforward. What you've seen earlier in many of these presentations is an increase in two things. One is the level of uncertainty facing networks today. You saw the graph from the 50s to the 90s on peak demand, and you see the difference in the trajectory of that graph recently. The second is the options, really. I just heard a comment about TransGrid focused on the non-build options, on opportunities to not build a line in order to fulfill an energy need. Those non-build options, whether demand-side management, whether distributed generation, are becoming more mature. So those options are becoming more real. So when you have uncertainty, an increase in uncertainty and an increase in options, it's actually a more complicated decision. And I think TransGrid, its board, and certainly the regulator have taken the sensible decision that if you're going to make these complicated decisions on behalf of your users, let's get them involved a little bit more actively. So that's a sensible decision where we're making these trade-offs to get people who pay for these trade-offs and have the impacts in terms of service and risk of those decisions to be involved in those decisions. For TransGrid, this has been actually quite an interesting and challenging development, because TransGrid, I would say, is one of the organizations within the energy value chain that has spent the least amount of time interacting with a broad set of its consumers. And at the same time, if you look at the energy value chain in New South Wales, every single household, just about every household, commercial and industrial business is a consumer. So we go from low level of interaction to what is actually 7 million interactions, or some form of interactions with 7 million users. So it's been quite a jump. And so what we've been so we very much believe in the benefit of the exercise in order to align our decisions with the interests, needs, and wants of those 7 million users. Also, by the way, 7 million heads are better than the 1,000 we have inside the tent. So crowdsourcing some of these decisions could actually end up with better results. So the question for us now isn't whether or not to do it. The question and the challenge has been how to do it. And what I'd like to walk you through now in the next couple of slides is how TransGrid is going about interacting with this large consumer base in order to get them involved and collaborating in the decisions that we make. Now, we've broken this exercise into basically three parts as a business. One is what we're calling business planning, and that's really talking about the revenue reset, pricing methodology, decisions we make that are really business decisions for us, but on behalf of consumers who pay the bills. The second group of consultations is around project planning. This is an area that we have historically spent a lot of time interacting with impacted communities, but less so more broadly with consumers on decisions to spend their money on a project-by-project basis. You've heard that there's a lot fewer augmentation or demand-driven projects, but there's still quite a renewal program. The third one is network planning, and so that's what we're here about today. So what I'd like to finish my talk off is to talk a bit about how to get you folks and other consumers more involved in the decisions that you see up in the report on your seats and up on the screen today. What's great is we actually have our planners and our asset managers in the room, so you can influence them all you want at the break during the Q&A. So just talking about consulting on the business plan. So one of the major challenges is this 7 million question, right? So it's not a prudent use of consumers' money to go and try and talk to every one of those 7 million people. So there's a real balancing act here. How do we get what seems like useful input from the full state of consumers? And the way that we've broken it down is in those three categories on the screen. We actually try and segment our audience a bit and think about who are the ones that are actually a bit more educated, who have a bit more time to spend on energy, and therefore will have an ability to put real input into where the levers are that affect their bills. Those are the bottom two categories, the large energy users and what we're calling consumer industry and business groups. So we've spent a significant amount of time not shying away from the folks who know enough to poke the holes where they should be poking the holes. So we've brought together a large energy user roundtable and spent some time on one-on-one briefings, a consumer advisory panel at the bottom, also one-on-one briefings, to really ask the hard questions and listen to the hard answers. We don't agree on everything, but we certainly have robust discussions. The large energy users, while being a small percentage of our users, is actually quite a significant percentage of our load. So it's actually really important to understand some of their requirements and some of the impacts of our decisions on their businesses. We'd be remiss if we stopped there, though. Although that gives us some of the better challenges to some of our decisions and some really good sophisticated input, that top area, actually trying to reach out a bit more broadly, is something that has been expected of us and something that's, I think, important just to test the directions that we go in. We've done that through some surveys, through access to our websites. We do it also through a very small, targeted, deliberative forums where we bring people in for the day, give them a full day to educate them a little bit more on what we do and educate us a little bit more on how they think. And that gives us a bit of more of an understanding about householders think about energy and how they value different decisions that we're making. We do that without talking to the full set, but to give a good, let's say, a good significant data set or subset. So that gives you a sense of how we've broken it down and some of the activities we're doing. To give you a sense of the topics that we've gone through in that business planning exercise, this is some of the stuff we've been talking about recently. So clearly in a revenue reset year where we're going to set in place a revenue proposal and then decide on 4 or 5 years of revenue, that needs to be a big part of the discussion. So we spend quite a lot of time on exactly what we're asking for in terms of capital, in terms of operating expense. We have discussions about rate of return and about what are the other building blocks of that revenue ask. And some of the drivers of some of the, you've heard a bit of it today, but drivers of some of that ask as well. On top of the revenue proposal, there's a pricing methodology. I think there was some discussion earlier about how it is, how we're taking into account some of our users and interested parties' discussions around whether or not we're pricing most effectively, whether or not our pricing is sending the signals to allow people to react in such a way that might actually pull down that peak and align it more closely with the energy used. As Stephen said, it's quite a complicated process, and in fact, we don't have all the levers as one part of a value chain, basically 2 steps removed from end users, but it's one that we're proactive in as part of that value chain. And there are other topics on the left, some of which were touched on today. What I find quite interesting, is inspiring, is even when talking about the revenue ask or the reset, there's a significant subset of users who are actually more interested to test us on what our vision is for the future. Tell us how you're going to support a future that aligns with what our users want or what our users are interested in. It's quite a big percentage in the surveying we've done who are looking for a clean energy future, for instance. And they want to know what we're doing, even though we're generation agnostic, to support or not be a barrier to that future. So that vision, that longer term view, is also another thing that we've been talking about, and understanding how we can align our actions with their interests. In terms of projects now, I'll just go through 2 slides. So on the project basis, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to planning in detail and implementing a solution, which in the past was often a corridor option, a build option, we had quite an interaction with impacted communities. The area where we didn't spend as much time or perhaps collaborate as much was up in the identifying need and reviewing those options. Now, we went through a process that was regulated and allowed for public submissions in the RIT-T, but when we got to the build process, we often had the discussion about how the folks on the ground in the build, hadn't really noticed that other process, hadn't been involved in the discussion about why we were building what we're building, not just where we were building it. So we've taken it on ourselves to be much more open and collaborative and actually extending this stakeholder engagement process upfront on projects. And really being proactive on driving the options that allow us to either defer or avoid the build, so that when we have to talk to somebody about potentially building something, not only are we quite sure, but there's a body of public support for the decision that we're making. And the example of that at the moment in what looks like a non-growth environment, at least the next few years, is the Powering Sydney's Future, where here's an opportunity. It's a renewal project, right? It's not based on demand growth. It's based on replacing other assets, a lot of them distributor assets. But still, we can go through the process of testing. Is there a way, what happens if demand actually falls quite a bit further than expected? What are some options to defer and avoid and keep the option open not to spend that money? So we're going through that process with what is potentially over $400 million of spend, but it's becoming the process, the way we think about projects going forward. Final thing is on network planning, which is really what we're talking about today. I think this sort of a forum where we have people in the industry hearing about the network plan is something that I think is something that TransGrid has done well in the past. But translating that plan now to different folks and different audiences, talking to different regions about how this plan impacts them, local councils, MPs, activist groups, is a step that we're going to take now that we haven't taken to the same extent in the past. So expect to see what you have on your seats split up by region, a little bit more digestible in other forms as we go forward, and expect to hear a lot more about feedback on this plan. So not only on our website, but in these forums, we're really trying to understand what people think about the decisions we've made in this plan. As we move forward, and this is a 10-year rolling plan that's updated every year, we expect to see more robust engagement on early drafts of the plan next year, right? This is a process, right? A program of us becoming more open and collaborative in everything we do, especially in our decisions that we make in planning and building this business. You should expect to see us get better every year. And we're going to use some of the feedback you give us today, some of the feedback we're getting from some different groups that I've mentioned earlier, to try and open this up even further next year and further the year after. Soon you won't need us, you can write the thing yourselves. Finally, on document structure, what we've got there is just a bit of a discussion about whether we got the document exactly right, and we are looking for submissions and feedback on that, as Peter mentioned this morning. So I will end on that slide and take some questions after doing a quick plug for the Have Your Say website. yoursay.transgrid.com.au. Get on it. Everything we say in a forum like this, published on there almost immediately. Opportunities for folks to give us comments and feedbacks, and then in real time we'll try to adjust based on it. You can also see a link from our corporate website. Now free to ask some questions.
Thank you.